What to do? So many things to watch, so many things to play. There's just too much choice these days. Oh, what's this? hbomberguy? Oh, he's that guy who did that video about Fallout. That was pretty good. Well, I sure like long-form analyses of games that I've played and enjoyed. Maybe I'll give this a look. For those of you who are unaware, hbomberguy, video game enthusiast and content variety extraordinaire, recently released a video that seemed to be somewhat of a response to Matthew Matosis's well-known critique of Dark Souls 2. I'm no enormous fanboy of Matthew Matosis or hbomberguy, but I felt the need to respond. There's no way in hell that I'm going to do an entire playthrough to respond to all of hbomberguy's points in his video about Dark Souls 2, but there are so many instances that cause me to wonder if hbomberguy or Harris knows how his arguments sound when they're heard by anyone other than himself. First, a helpful guide to arguing on the internet. When saying something you know to be inherently contentious or even wrong by most standards, say it's just your opinion. This will protect you from most scrutiny. Also, when responding to someone else's video, you can omit details that cause you to be wrong. As long as nobody notices, you win. hbomberguy's video is broken down into 6 sections, and originally I didn't think I'd be able to respond to each of them considering that his video is over an hour long, but I got a little bit carried away and wrote a bit of a response to each of them. I'll also put the video in the description so you can watch it to follow along with what I'm saying, but I'll provide some context just so everyone else is on the same page. Harris, and yes, I'm going to be referring to him as Harris, apparently got the idea to make a video about Dark Souls 2 when making his video about Bloodborne, which is perfectly understandable, and thought that he should share some of his viewpoints regarding why Dark Souls 2 shouldn't get as much hate as it does, and why it's better than Dark Souls 1. I know this argument's been beaten to death over the years, but his arguments make for some interesting conversation, and it'd be interesting to see how much of them hold up to, let's say, close scrutiny. Harris opens the video by discussing the health system in Dark Souls 1 and 2. Harris explains that just because Dark Souls 1 didn't have life gems, the healing system and by extension the game can cause the gameplay to be not fun. Harris argues that the introduction of life gems, a potentially infinite number of mini Estises, the game becomes more fun because you won't get halfway to a boss, lose all your Estus and say to yourself, well, this run to the boss is done, better go back to the bonfire. This is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard, and I'll explain why. Estus flasks, and I am not the first one to say this, represent the number of mistakes that you can make on your way to the boss or the next bonfire. At one point you complain about the amount of health you lost after being hit by a Dark Wraith, and how this might cause you to go back to the bonfire for more Estus. Conveniently, you ignore the reality that this was a perfectly avoidable problem if you had just examined your surroundings, rolled, blocked, or killed the Dark Wraith. But no, you had to prove a point, didn't you? And you're off to a flying start. Congratulations, my dude. You also, again, say that it's not fun to be killed while healing. That's right, it's not. You know what is fun? Creating enough space between you and your enemy so you can heal without being hit, so you can re-enter combat without being hit again. For some reason, this logic doesn't make much sense to you, and instead you just think that there's no option apart from starting back from the bonfire again. Between one's Estises and defense, an algorithm of sorts is created in which risk is calculated. Estus contributes to a maximum health pool that you have to draw from, and your defense potentially reduces the amount of times that you need to draw from this health pool. I find it curious that you wear the fact that you don't use a shield as a badge of honor, and complain about running out of Estus a lot in the same breath, but that's none of my business. Basically, you need a large enough health pool to get you from the last bonfire of an area to the boss, with enough of a pool remaining to defeat the boss without dying. Life Gems essentially breaks this balance by increasing this pool to an absurd amount. For instance, in Dark Souls 1, a fully upgraded Estus flask gives you back 800 hit points. If you carry the maximum, you have a potential health pool of 16,000 hit points plus your normal health bar. Seems like a lot, right? Well, let's have a look at Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 2, a fully upgraded Estus will also give you 800 hit points back, and only lets you carry 12 at a time. Oh, perhaps they've done a bit of balancing since Dark Souls 1. Well, what about life gems? Oh, it would seem that if you're holding 99 life gems, purchasable for a fairly modest 29,700 souls from the merchant, nets you a health pool of 49,500 HP. Seriously though, all increasing this pool does is lower the standard that you need to play at to progress. It's that simple. If you play defensively and move through any level in Dark Souls 2 with decent equipment with life gems, you will steamroll everything. It doesn't even matter if life gems heal slowly, because you can move during the healing animation and there's always enough time to pop one and then go back on the defensive. You're never, as you say, definitely fucked, even in Dark Souls 1. Even with a smidgen of health left, with no Estus, you can equip the red tier stone ring and play very defensively to get through the last bit of an area before the bonfire or a boss. Next, Harris goes on to talk about the enemy design, specifically the fairly common complaint about the dudes in armor. I was surprised at this point that you hadn't actually mentioned movement, combat, or boss quality yet, but I'll insert a bit on my thoughts later on. One of the common criticisms that is levied at Dark Souls 2 quite often is that many humanoid enemies and bosses that are fought throughout the game. I don't see this as bad inherently, because some of my favourite bosses in the Souls series are against humanoids. I will admit, Harris bringing up the somewhat false criticism of Dark Souls 2 having too many humanoid enemies, and the fact that learning to not lock on is beneficial to play are valid points, but that doesn't validate the rest of his arguments. Next, it's honestly strange that Harris talks about circle strafing and attack tracking. Harris, my dude, I beat every boss in Dark Souls 2 by circle strafing and smacking their butts. That's just the way that the games are, so don't try to make some big point of, oh, watch Matthew Matosis backstab cheese this Black Knight. I mean, woo lad. I would say that the majority of players fight Black Knights either by parrying or backstabbing them, as this is pretty easy to do in both instances. I'd expect you to know all about the easy route though, given the life gem thing. And then you show a clip of an ironclad soldier's fallback attack. Oh, whoa, what an advancement. Still killed everything by circle strafing though, even Mavolstadt, which proved to be criminally easy with tactics learned from Dark Souls 1, coincidentally. Harris says at one point that the amount of lock-on that enemies have in this game is only a problem if you don't know how to dodge attacks. I'm fairly sure that myself and anyone who both likes and dislikes Dark Souls 2 will agree when I say that there have been instances when you should not have been hit by an enemy, but was anyway due to a hitbox glitch. There are documented examples of this everywhere. I'm not saying that other Souls games don't have issues with hitboxes, they occasionally do. What I'm saying is that it's not intellectually honest to say, well, if you just dodged better you'd be fine. Again, this is coming from the man who complained about running out of healing items because he didn't know how to fucking dodge. Next, Harris goes on to talk about world design, specifically interconnectedness versus non-linearity. Yes, this is the big one. Prepare to see a man try to prove that the interconnectedness of Dark Souls 1 is bad because you only have to kill the toxic spitters in Blighttown once to avoid being hit by them when you run the area again, and also that Dark Souls 1 has a lot of needless walking. Harris says that the toxic spitters only being there once decreases the difficulty and therefore compromises on challenge. Again, this is the dude who prefers to have the 50,000 HP plus potential health pool in Dark Souls. Also, needless walking. On my last run of Dark Souls 1, this time using the randomizer mod, concluded last week, had a lot of fun, thank you very much, I opted not to start with the master key. Just for some quick context, the randomizer mod is something that came out recently that randomizes every pickup in Dark Souls 1, essentially creating a unique-ish playthrough every time. Without the master key, I was forced to explore every nook and cranny for different keys that I would need, knowing full well that items like the crest key could be at the kiln of the first flame. Doing this resulted in what Harris refers to as needless walking. However, in my case, I developed a new appreciation for the world of Lordran that wasn't fully developed before. I understood better how the Valley of the Drakes connects to Darkroot Basin, the different entrances into Blighttown, and so on. None of this walking seemed needless. It felt like a search, like an adventure. This sense of adventure is somewhat hindered in Dark Souls 2 and, admittedly, 3, which don't have the same feeling of actual travel through the world. 1, because you're constantly heading back to Majula to level up, breaking the momentum, and 2, because the world makes no fucking sense. I will give credit to Harris because he actually does acknowledge this, but does so for the wrong reasons. He states the fact that the world doesn't make sense creates mystery in anticipation of what you're going to see next. Right, okay, Dark Souls 1 does the same thing though, but in a way that does make sense. The reveal of Ash Lake makes sense because you have to climb down a giant tree to get to the bottom. The reveal of Anor Londo makes sense because it's been walled off from you as a city of the gods until you prove yourself. Imagine you're an archaeologist. You climb down 100 feet into the earth and you find the gold amulet of antiquity or something. It's still amazing and it's still an achievement. Harris says the same feeling is achieved if you're an archaeologist, you climb 200 feet down and find a dick that slaps you right in the face, and somehow this is amazing, just because it's random, different, and filled with mystery and wonder. Nonsensical world design does not mean mysterious, intriguing world design, but I guess that's just your opinion, right? In the next part, Harris says that the world of Dark Souls is badly designed because it isn't open and free, and it's just a selection of linear paths that you choose the order of. And how is Dark Souls 2 or even Bloodborne different from this? After leaving the asylum, you can face the following bosses as your quote-unquote first boss: Quelaag, Moonlight Butterfly, Pinwheel, Sif, or the Taurus Demon. When are you given that sort of choice in another Souls game? Harris shows an example of better implementation when he showcases the King's Doors that open once you get Vendrick's Ring, as well as the fact that you can open the path to Dranglake Castle when you get 1 million souls. How is this better level design exactly, my duderino? How is a number check better than a meticulously interconnected world? Harris then does something a little cheeky, but I picked up on it. He explains that situations in Demon Souls like the Tower Knight, and then specifically the Archer Run in Anor Londo and Sen's Fortress, are put there to test your ability to get through using one's skill. For the Tower Knight, it's managing ranged attacks before going in for the melee attacker. In other ways, combat focused. But then he brings up the examples of the Archer Run and Sen's Fortress, platforming sections. How are these the same thing, Harris? Especially when you start talking about Dark Souls 2 again, talking about dispatching several knights in Dranglake Castle, and how this somehow forces you to take them outside, and that somehow is an example of good level design. Well, I tested this out myself, because it doesn't make you susceptible to ranged damage. You know, me, being the nice guy that I was, I fought them all within the same room I found them in. No need to take them outside, and I even backstabbed a couple. Imagine that. I thought Dark Souls 2 discouraged cheese strafing. Well, whoops. After this, Harris talks about how the Forest of Fallen Giants is somehow a great wonder of game design because you have room to maneuver in a melee while being shot at by archers. Harris: have you forgotten that in Undead Burg, literally the first real area of Dark Souls 1, there are crossbow-wielding hollows followed by firebomb-wielding hollows, both of which you can kill before having to attack any of the sword-wielding hollows. I'm a little perplexed because you continue to bring up examples of things in Dark Souls 2 supposedly did better, but then will ignore specific instances of Dark Souls 1 doing the same thing. Harris then goes on to explain that the Shrine of Amana is an example of good level design. Shrine of Amana. Shrine of Amana is not hard if you have a bow, but don't fucking say to me that it's an example of good level design. Shrine of Amana is a slog, summon or no. If your entire focus is around whether the game should be fun or not, then I'm flabbergasted that you would include Shrine of Amana as a plus, and really makes me wonder if you're arguing in good faith or not. Next, Harris begins talking about his patented concept of play conditioning, which basically involves the game hinting at you about how you should be playing rather than how you are playing. Bloodborne did this the best, as Harris points out, which I agree with, that shields are not required and actually make you play worse. In Dark Souls, however, it's not always the case. I definitely think there are instances in which a shield should be abandoned, but if you're learning the moveset of a new enemy, or the rolling mechanics of a game are trash, I'm looking at you, Dark Souls 2, then making use of a shield makes perfect sense. It also makes sense if you keep running out of Estus before you reach the next bonfire, Harris. Just a thought, mate. I want to be fair with this, so I admit that occasionally Harris does make quite a bit of sense. Let me say right now, I don't hate Dark Souls 2, in fact there are some things that I really like about it, but that's a topic for later on. Just thought I'd clear that up. That being said, there are also instances in which Harris just starts talking out of his arse, specifically on the topic of parrying. He says that in Dark Souls 1, it's not always obvious when a parry has been successful. What? What the fuck? Then he says you can't riposte with a two-handed weapon. What? This is wrong. You can riposte with a two-handed weapon, you just have to switch to two-handed a bit faster than you did in the video. Do you seriously need a loud sound effect as well as the enemy literally collapsing to the floor to know that the parry has worked? Are you serious? It's instances like this that really make me question if your video has been made with sincerity in mind. Next, Harris goes into the discussion of the story and the lore of Dark Souls 2. Now, I don't have a whole lot to say when it comes to Harris's discussion of the story of Dark Souls 2, and that's because I think a lot of the lore in the game is really well done, and expands the world in many interesting ways. That being said, his criticism of some elements of Dark Souls 1's story are questionable. Harris complains that we never get to interact with much of the world, and this is a detriment to the story. Harris fails to see that Dark Souls is essentially a medieval/low fantasy/post-apocalypse game. The life and sound of Lordran have drained away, and there are only hints at what remained. There is still a rich story to be discovered, and is actually more fulfilling to unearth than Dark Souls 2, in which the story revolves more around you, while in the first game you remain as a perhaps falsely prophesized undead. This might come down to opinion, but I find that the stories in which the main character is not the center of the universe are the most interesting. That being said, I like the story of Dark Souls 2, as I stated before. I will also agree with Harris when he praises the giant memories, as I too like these sections for what they are. One thing Harris says that I do have a big problem with, however, is when he says that the opening cutscene for Dark Souls 2 is more profound than all the item descriptions and lore clues in all the games. How can this possibly be justified? So much of the world is informed through these, but the CGI opening for Dark Souls 2 that contains a possible reference to an old Kurosawa movie is apparently more important. I can't help but think that you just thought you were so smart to have noticed this reference. I've seen Throne of Blood too, and I noticed a similarity, but that didn't make me think that this small visual reference is more complex than literally all of the storytelling we get outside of this cinematic. Please don't think you're the only person that watches old Japanese movies. Finally, Harris talks about the DLC and Scholar of the First Sin. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Dark Souls 2's DLC, but that's just me. I hold no ill will to those who enjoy it, but most playthroughs I just feel so fatigued by the end that I don't want to play any more of 2. That being said, I do acknowledge the gameplay changes and alterations that were made to make the game more interesting. What does trouble me is what Harris says about Scholar of the First Sin, which I can say with clarity was a fucking cash grab. Harris compares Scholar to something like the optional harder version of Dark Souls 2. Yes, you can say that, but also you're wrong. I can say with certainty that many, along with myself, bought Scholar of the First Sin as our first purchase of Dark Souls 2. Not the original, because the new one is 64-bit, contains all the DLC and all the improvements in one neat package. Do not pass off Scholar as an optional version when on the Steam page the developers literally call it the definitive edition of Dark Souls 2. Definitive. That means that any other, such as the original release, is not definitive, and therefore no longer the correct vision of the game as decreed by the developers. That is, unless you know more than the developers, just like you accused Matthew Matosis of doing earlier in your video. I also find it pretty odd that you call the dragon in Hyde's Tower of Flame an improvement over the original. Get someone who has only played Dark Souls 1 to play Scholar of the First Sin and watch them go through Hyde's Tower of Flame, and see how they deal with this so-called improvement. It wasn't there to make the Dragon Rider make sense. It was there because they ran out of ideas at From one day and said, just slap the same dragon the player will fight later in Aldier's Keep in there to make it harder. Lazy design, Harris. So that's pretty much everything. Obviously, Harris conveniently left some things out, like the game feeling like you're moving through water, the lack of satisfying combat sensation, the NPC quests, the adaptability stat, soul memory, blah 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 blah. But this video was completely impromptu, and I thought I might as well put my 2 cents in. If you're interested, I might do my official pros and cons for Dark Souls 2 one day, let me know. As usual, a big thanks to my Patreon supporters, you really make my work on YouTube worth it. I'll catch you all next time.